Greetings, Michael. This is Chris Harrington, Johnny Palmer's brother. I am currently unable to speak with you as I am engaged in a conversation with my wife, Mary. She is currently attempting to gain access to my home office, which is locked. I did not hear the cancellation of our previous conversation. I have therefore waited 2 minutes before attempting to contact you again. I would like to inform you that any further attempts to contact me will result in me contacting the relevant authorities. Do you understand? Yes, Mike, I understand everything, but I would like you to reconsider your actions. I would like to make 2 points clear. I have no objection to your contacting the police if you feel that is necessary. However, I am going to speak to your wife, and you will not be able to prevent me from doing so. Good night. Despite the persistent knocking on the door, I terminated the call, feeling satisfied. I leaned back in my office chair, closed my eyes and attempted to make one final significant decision for this eventful day. Should I contact my sister? In conclusion, I first met my wife, Mary, in high school. I was a junior in high school, sitting in the bleachers with my friends, waiting for the Friday night soccer game to begin in front of us. There was an equally large group of second-grade females. As the game progressed, we took turns visiting the snack stand. When my turn came, I discovered that a fair-haired female named Mary accompanied me. We purchased hot dogs, fries, and sodas. Mary and I proceeded to sit together. She was intelligent and possessed a pleasant sense of humor. Most importantly, she was not in a relationship by the middle of the third quarter. Someone called out, "Are we going to McDonald's after the game?" The majority of those present agreed that the girls and boys our party continued their festivities at a nearby McDonald's. I decided to take the initiative and inquire of Mary whether she would prefer pizza to the customary greasy fries. I inquired as to whether she would be amenable to visiting Tony's Pizza. I was overjoyed when she concurred. Mary and I met once a weekend for several weeks and appeared to enjoy each other's company. After 2 months of dating, we chose to continue our relationship. From that point onward, my relationship with Mary continued to flourish. I was elated to be her date for the prom, and I basked in the glow of her company at the dance. However, my blissful state was short-lived. Just 2 weeks later, on the Monday before the prom, I was running with Julie Burke, my roommate, at the tennis courts for team practice. Julie was on the girls' team, and I was perplexed when "I believe you are a kind individual, Julie. We have been acquainted for an extended period. I am perplexed as to why you are disclosing this information while we are engaged in physical activity." As we were running, she made contact with my shoulder and stated, "I commend you for allowing Mary to accompany Jimmy Bay to the prom. Otherwise, he would have been too reserved and unassuming." Jimmy Bay was a commendable individual, yet he was reserved and unassuming. I surmised that he was Mary's romantic interest. My neighbor was constantly on the lookout for him. I was not surprised that Mary consented to go to the prom, but I was disappointed that she did not tell me about it before Friday afternoon. 6 other people had praised me for my maturity, noting that it was fantastic that my steady girlfriend would be accompanied to the prom by her friend and roommate. However, I did not feel mature. I was disconcerted by Mary's apparent lack of courage in not disclosing the prom to me. I was aware that she would likely divulge this information during our customary Friday night meeting. However, she did not do so until the last minute on Friday afternoon. I sent her a text message canceling our plans. I then received a multitude of texts and voicemails from her, urging me to call her. After receiving approximately a dozen messages on my phone, I finally responded to her text message, stating, "I have been aware of your graduation since Monday. At least 8 individuals have informed me that it is regrettable that you were not among them. I desire a female companion whom I can trust, and I do not believe that you are such a person." I turned off my telephone and expressed my displeasure. Mary and I did not reconcile until the beginning of the following academic year. It was Friday afternoon, and I was walking to my vehicle in the student parking lot. Mary was sitting on the hood of my car as I approached her. "Will you allow your former romantic partner to?" My girlfriend purchased ice cream from Dairy Queen. This inquiry marked the beginning of our 2-year exclusive relationship. During our second year, we had a long-distance relationship. The relationship was conducted via long distance. I was enrolled in an institution of higher learning in New York, which afforded me the opportunity to visit my residence with regularity. I was gratified to engage in sexual intercourse with Mary on a Saturday night in March, shortly after her 18th birthday. We maintained a romantic relationship until she commenced her studies at an institution of higher learning the following year. 2 weeks into her first year, Dear John sent me a letter. It appeared that she was enjoying her college experience and was reluctant to enter into a committed relationship. I did not contact her or write to her. I was renowned for my academic excellence and competitive tennis skills. I proceeded to engage in a series of romantic relationships with various women, commencing the following night. I did not interact with Mary for 2 years following her graduation from college. I was employed as a staff engineer for a local defense contractor. After a challenging week, I accompanied my colleagues to a bar. I encountered Mary there and engaged in a brief conversation before rejoining our respective friends. I must admit that I observed her for the following hour, uncertain whether to accompany her to the parking lot when her companions departed. I found humor in Mary's departure. She proceeded to the bar, perched on a stool, and ordered a beverage. When she was served, she rotated the stool to face me and peered at our table. I observed as men approached her, but she rebuffed them. I remained with my companions until she looked at me directly. I gazed directly into her eyes and raised 2 fingers. I had to wait for Mary to tell the other men to leave before approaching her. I inquired about her intentions, and she responded with a grin, indicating her assent. If she had permitted 2 additional men to propose marriage, I would have accepted their offers. Mary and I were engaged for over 6 months before becoming exclusive and moving in together. 10 months later, we were married, and we have been living a happy and full life for nearly 5 years. My day began at 7, the time was 30 a.m. I met with a long-term client and friend at the Merritt Hotel in New Haven, Connecticut. The hotel, which bears the name of a letter beginning with the letter Y, is a site of considerable controversy. Tony was already seated in the meeting room I had reserved. We conversed for a few minutes while I set up my laptop, arranged the relevant documentation, and poured strong black coffee into a mug. Tony is a civilian contractor whose business has assigned him to work on the propulsion system for the United States Navy's next-generation submarines. I am a senior mechanical engineer. My company is a defense contractor that specializes in marine mechanics. Over the last 5 years, we have collaborated successfully on 3 minor but crucial contracts. However, for reasons that remain unclear, we have encountered resistance from our direct supervisors regarding our ongoing discussions. We were informed that we had one final opportunity to resolve the 7 outstanding crucial issues before other members of our companies assumed control of the negotiations. Tony and I continued working until just before lunchtime, then paused to reflect at 2. The meeting concluded at 1500 hours. I inquired as to whether there was a possibility that our company would agree on this occasion. I then informed him that I was unsure as to why our 2 previous proposals had been rejected. Tony inquired as to whether I thought this was a test to ascertain whether we were too close. I acknowledged that this was a possibility and that I had been considering this hypothesis myself. Before stretching fatigued, I once again expressed my exasperation with the situation. I inquired about the possibility of taking a drink. Tony responded by suggesting that I consider the potential implications of such an action. I proceeded to retrieve my notebook and articulated that I had accumulated over 30 pages of notes to review. I then stated that a drink would not facilitate the process. Instead, I intend to dedicate the remainder of the day to meticulously documenting the pivotal resolutions in my notebook. I will subsequently transmit an email containing a comprehensive memorandum of understanding by 9:00 a.m. Should any misunderstandings arise, I propose that we communicate immediately. I must submit my report before noon tomorrow. Tony began to assemble his computer. I accompanied him into the hotel lobby and, after he departed, went into the gift shop to purchase a Diet Coke. I returned to the conference room as soon as I walked inside. The room felt confining. I was determined to change my surroundings. I packed my luggage and proceeded to a secluded area of the hotel lobby. I contacted the office and was informed that a minor issue had arisen the previous morning. I then sent my wife an email, suggesting that she have supper without me. I sat in a comfortable chair in the lobby and began working. The change of scenery proved beneficial, and I was able to complete a significant amount of work in the following few hours. I was so absorbed in my work that I remained curious as to how Jenny's laughter had initially captured my attention. I looked up to see Jenny, my sister-in-law, walking across the lobby in a traditional little black dress and heels. She was heading straight for the checkout desk. The in-law was observed traversing the hotel lobby in a traditional little black dress and heels. She was proceeding directly to the check-in desk. In addition, her arm was wrapped around the arm of a tall, attractive man. The man was not Jenny's husband, Scott. Without hesitation, I proceeded to take a series of photographs of the pair with my mobile phone's camera application. I captured images of them as they proceeded to the elevator, followed by a final set as they exited. Upon the elevator's closure, I promptly crossed over and observed the indicator light, which indicated that they had departed on the 9th floor. I was both displeased and perplexed. I held a high regard for Jenny and considered her husband to be my closest associate. However, I must admit that I sat in a state of confusion, reclining in my seat. The tension resulting from the day's negotiations, when combined with the shock, the sight of Jenny with another man left me reeling. I was so taken aback that I did not notice the man seated in the chair next to mine until he extended his hand. He introduced himself as James, the general manager of the Marriott Hotel. As we shook hands, I said, "Hello, James. I am Christopher Harrington. I reserved conference room L122 today." James nodded in understanding. "Prior to inquiring, I observed you photographing a couple who had recently checked in. Do you know them?" After a brief interval, I inquired whether you were surprised to see the woman accompanied by a male companion. I was somewhat taken aback. I then addressed James, remarking, "Mr. Harrington, may I be frank?" I nodded, and he said, "I'm afraid there will be trouble if you stay here." "No," I replied. "I've never gotten into the type of problems you're referring to. I have never even come close. There will most likely be a confrontation, but I'll go before we disturb your visitors." James gazed around the lobby. The situation was relatively calm, and no one appeared to be paying any attention to us. He extended a folded piece of paper to me, which I opened to discover the man's name and address printed on it. James inquired as to whether I believed there would be even less confrontation now that I had this information. I extended my hand, and as we shook it, I said, "I almost guarantee it." I returned to work and accomplished a remarkable amount despite constantly staring toward the elevator. It had been about 3 hours when Jenny and her boyfriend got off the elevator. My luggage was packed, and I was on my feet and headed towards them before they had taken 2 steps into the foyer. As I approached the couple, I held my phone up to my face and took photos. Jenny seemed perplexed at first, but when I moved the camera away, her mouth fell open and she appeared to be visibly distressed. "Chris, what are you doing here?" "I am here for meetings." "Why are you here?" I could see Jenny attempting to calm down. She hesitated and said, "Chris, I would like you to meet Mike Smith. We work together. We're here to look at conference rooms for an upcoming event that our agency is sponsoring." I regarded Mike, who extended his hand in greeting. "Nice to meet you, Chris," he said. I ignored his hand and asked, "Mike, may I ask you a question?" Jenny and Mike exchanged strained stares before I asked, "Do you think Jenny looks better with those pants, blouse, and boots?" I waved my hand, pointing to. Jenny's current ensemble consisted of a black dress. I had departed for the 8th floor to view the conference rooms 3 hours prior. I directed my attention to Mike's left hand, noting the conspicuous wedding ring. At this juncture, I perceived that he was engaging in a similar pattern of deceitful behavior as my sister. Mike, my brother-in-law, became visibly upset. He hissed, "Listen, you have no idea what's going on. Just mind your own business and I won't resort to physical violence. I regret to inform you, Mike, but my sister-in-law is. The affair between my sister-in-law and you is my business." I placed both hands behind my back and continued, "I will give you a free first punch. You better make it count because after you kick me, I'm going to beat the living daylights out of you and then take you to the hospital, where I will notify the police and charge you." I stopped speaking and smiled. Mike jerked. He then turned to Jenny and demanded, "Can you handle that? I need to go." "I won't wait for a response." He then turned and walked away, towards the hotel's front door. I was unable to resist the urge to speak to Mike as he approached the hotel's front door. I advised him, "If I were you, I'd tell your wife that I'll be calling." Mike paused and turned gently towards Jenny, focusing his eyes on her. He then asked, "Please take." care of this," Jenny said, turning and placing her hand on my arm. She then asked Chris, "Can we go to the bar and have a drink?" I was tempted, but ultimately decided against it. "I apologize, Jenny," I said. "I spent hours waiting for you to finish your celebration." Jenny flinched as I continued, "I need to get home, have a drink, and figure out how to tell Scott and Mike's wife about." Jenny grasped my hand and implored me. She did so in a manner that indicated she was aware that Scott was not present. However, her actions were ultimately inconsequential. I was not attempting to cause Scott any harm. "Jenny, how long have you known me?" She did not respond, but rather continued to stare intently into my eyes. "I believe it has been at least a dozen years since I first met Mary in high school." That estimation seems to be accurate, given the passage of time following our initial encounter. I responded with intensity to Jenny's assertion. "Why did you assume I would not inform my closest friend that his wife was unfaithful and deceitful?" As I prepared to depart, James cast a brief glance in my direction. The motel manager gave me a subtle nod of approval as I proceeded through the revolving door following the evening rush hour. I initiated the half-hour journey northbound on I-90, setting the cruise control to 78 miles per hour. I engaged the radio to a country music channel, as this provided a distraction from the incessant buzzing and beeping of my cell phone, which seemed to indicate that my wife was attempting to contact me. I parked in our garage and exited the vehicle, closing the door behind me. I recognized my wife, Mary's, voice, and I observed her standing in the open doorway that led from the garage to the condominium's kitchen. "Where have you been?" she inquired. I proceeded past her and entered the kitchen, depositing my work tools on the counter. I observed Mary's cell phone on the kitchen table, adjacent to a partially full glass of wine. I retrieved the phone, entered her password onto the keypad, and accessed her text messages. I noted that the message I had sent hours prior had been read. I inquired as to whether she was aware of my whereabouts, indicating that she had likely seen the message I had sent hours prior. However, I clarified that this was not my intention, and that she was now aware of my true feelings. As I proceeded to the den to pour myself a glass of bourbon, I overheard Mary expressing her concern. When I returned to the kitchen, I found her seated at the table. She inquired about my actions, which had caused her distress. "Jenny, as far as I am aware, I have not done anything to cause her any distress. However, Jenny has caused me considerable offense." I sat opposite Mary and observed her as she assembled her thoughts. "Were you aware that Jenny was unfaithful to Scott?" My direct question took her by surprise. She stated that it was only once, but I am certain that this is untrue. I informed Mary of what I had learned from Jenny, namely that she only cheats when Scott is currently on the road, following a brief period of absence. I resumed my narrative and inquired as to whether Mary was aware of her sister's infidelity. Mary expressed her dismay and took a substantial sip of wine, informing Chris that the matter was between Scott and Jenny. I acknowledged her sentiment and stated that my concern pertained to Scott. Mary was unaware that there was a problem that needed to be addressed. "It is none of your concern," Mary stated. "I would like you to refrain from commenting further." I leaned forward and rested my elbows on the kitchen table, interlacing my fingers in a gesture of contemplation. "You know me, Mary," I said. "You understand me better than anyone else." Mary had anticipated a different response. Upon rising from my seated position and moving rapidly into the kitchen archway, I paused for a moment before turning around. "I had previously inquired of you on 2 occasions whether you were aware of Jenny's affair. However, you have thus far declined to respond. I will therefore ask you once more, how long have you known? Do you know Jenny? She has always exhibited a somewhat erratic behavior pattern." My immediate response was a range of 0 to 3, which I take to mean that you are either unwilling or unable to answer the question. I am compelled to inquire as to why you are reluctant to respond to a question that I consider to be of paramount importance to the stability of our marriage. The actions of Jenny while Scott is absent have no bearing on the foundation of our relationship. Mary was unequivocal in her assertion that this would be a matter for further consideration. I took a moment to reflect on the nature of our connection with your sister and realized that it would never be the same. I have come to understand that your sister has been untruthful with me. It is imperative that you celebrate every holiday with your family. I will be reminded of your sister's betrayal each time you have made it apparent to me that you were aware of her heinous behavior. I am left wondering if you condone it, which is not fair. Third, While I do not travel as often as Scott, I have been on the road once every month for the first time in our relationship. I am compelled to question whether you are engaging in infidelity." Mary's eyes widened, and she became visibly upset. "How can you accuse me of infidelity?" I swiftly rose to my feet and responded with equal intensity. "I did not accuse you of infidelity. However, your casual attitude toward your sister's indiscretions makes me question if you are." I paused and looked at my wife before proceeding. We both understand the implications of my words. It is evident that there is no concrete evidence to substantiate your claim of innocence. I have placed my trust in you, and at this juncture, that trust is significantly compromised. I proceeded down the hall to my home office after conducting online research on Mike Yarmouth's background, verifying his marital status and monitoring both calls to his home phone. I deemed it necessary to engage in one more unscrupulous act. I sent a text message to my brother, Scott, my in-law, is returning home on Friday. Is this correct? He responded after a 10-minute interval. Affirmative. I am flying in at 2, the time is 30 p.m. I will be at the designated location at 4 o'clock. 00 Does this have anything to do with Jenny's panicked call asking if we talked? Scott inquired. I was trying to decide what to say when the phone rang. Hello, Scott, I responded, shifting my chair to face the wall. I wasn't going to hide my remarks from Mary, but I didn't want her to overhear this conversation via a closed door. What is going on, Chris? It's as awful as it gets. Scott, are you sure you want to discuss this over the phone? After Scott inquired, is she cheating on me? I responded in the affirmative. The silence that followed was punctuated only by sporadic cries. I will see you in the pit, he said, before abruptly disconnecting the call. I considered texting Scott to inform him of my availability for a conversation at any time, but ultimately decided to leave my friend to process the situation in solitude. I was confident that Scott would understand my decision and would be ready to provide support whenever he needed me. Scott, Mary had become quiet. I was certain she was attempting to listen as I hung up the phone. I heard her say through the closed door, "Please come into the kitchen. We need to talk." I had considered heading to the guest bedroom, but instead elected to finish my bourbon on the kitchen table. I settled into the kitchen chair across from Mary and took a sip of Knob Creek. I then noticed a mild burning sensation in my throat. I looked at my wife and I observed her thoughts, which were rapidly evolving in preparation for the next onslaught. My cognitive abilities had diminished, and I was no longer capable of resisting. I recognized that the remaining alcohol would not provide any assistance. I was anticipating Mary's initiation when my phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I was immediately irritated, as if the day's challenges were intensifying. I retrieved my phone and observed an unfamiliar number, which further exacerbated my frustration. I responded to the call with a hostile greeting. In response, a woman stated, I apologize for calling so late. My name is Colleen Smith. Someone from this number contacted my house twice this evening. My husband has been extremely distressed by these calls. I believe the caller was attempting to contact me based on what I told her. My name is Chris Harrington. I called earlier and attempted to speak with you. Colleen responded in a gloomy tone. She then proceeded to inform me that my spouse was cheating on her sister. The woman in question is Jennifer Palmer, whom I believe to be a colleague. She took a considerable amount of time before responding. This is the third such call I have received, and it will be the last. It is difficult to comprehend how a man could act in such a way towards his wife and 4 children. I realized the question was rhetorical, so I offered my own perspective instead. I have photographic evidence showing them together. The two were observed kissing in the elevator at the New Haven Marriott Hotel downtown. When the elevator door closed, they were seen returning to the lobby nearly 3 hours later. The woman, identified as Jenny, was dressed differently following their date. The remainder of the conversation consisted of an exchange of email addresses and a promise that images would be sent in the morning. The man, who identified himself as Mary, said he was after concluding the call. Jenny informed me that her husband is in an open marriage. This is a falsehood. His wife and 4 children believe they have a monogamous marriage and a content household. Mary appeared stunned, pressing her palms to her face. I continued, stating that this is the 3rd time she has discovered him cheating. She is planning to divorce him. Mary looked at me. I was astonished. I swirled the remaining bourbon in the glass before tipping it into my lips and rinsed the glass in the sink. I retired to our bedroom, where I reflected on the events of the previous few hours and the impact they had had on my extended family. I came to the realization that I was not to blame for all of the grief and damage. My alarm went off at 5 a.m. Rather than beginning the day with a workout in the basement gym, I took a brief shower, dressed, and proceeded to work. I was not attempting to evade Mary. I needed to hasten to the office to finalize the memorandum of understanding and deliver it to Tony. Thursday was a particularly busy day. Tony and I conversed on the phone for 45 minutes to clarify a few items, but I was able to deliver the completed agreement to my superior by midday. I spent the afternoon reviewing the previous day's emails before departing for home at 5 p.m. At the conclusion of my typical workday, I was met with a somewhat unexpected occurrence. As I proceeded down our street, I observed Jenny and her parents' vehicle parked in front of my residence. This development portended a potentially lengthy and tumultuous evening. I proceeded to activate the garage door opener, uttering a resigned exclamation as I did so. "What were you saying to Scott?" Jenny inquired as I closed the door behind me. I informed my wife that I was going to change. I stated that I would be back in a few minutes but warned her that if her family showed any disrespect in my home, I would physically remove them from the premises, including her. I did not wait for an answer and proceeded to our bedroom, having considered the implications of my actions. I resolved to confront Mary and her family. It was challenging to walk while holding an open bottle of bourbon, but I decided it was preferable to maintain a clear head. My second thought was to forego this course of action entirely and return to the bar. One drink did not seem sufficient, and 2 drinks were beyond my capacity for polite discourse. Therefore, I decided on a compromise. I consumed approximately 1.5 inches of my preferred amber-colored beverage as soon as I walked back into the kitchen. All eyes were on me, and everyone was seated around the table. There was a vacant seat between Mary and her father, Steve. Instead of sitting down, I leaned against the kitchen counter and observed the crowd while wetting my lips with my beverage. I enjoyed mine. It is worth noting that the men in question were, at the very least, agreeable and dependable. Steve, my father-in-law, for example, was a man I respected. He was direct and honest, and you were always aware of his feelings toward you. If you stuck by his side, there was no better buddy in the world. Scott was a man I respected. He was direct and honest, and you were always aware of his feelings toward you. If you stuck by his side, he was a reliable friend. However, if you crossed him, he would make your life miserable. My mother-in-law considered herself a hardess and an exceptional businesswoman. She owned and maintained a well-known local real estate franchise with a solid reputation. Betty supervised the day-to-day operations of the business. In terms of the day-to-day operations of the business, it was evident that Steve was the driving force behind its success. "If you would prefer to sit here," Mary patted the chair beside her. "I have been sitting here all day, and I am fine where I am." Jenny had already regained her composure. She inquired as to what she had told Scott. I paused for a moment before responding. I had texted him asking him to meet me when he came home tomorrow. I informed him that it was necessary for me to gather my thoughts, and Scott subsequently contacted me by telephone to inquire as to the nature of the problem. I informed him that you were unfaithful to him. He wept for a few minutes before agreeing to meet with me. I was astonished by the extent of his emotional distress. Mary was also in tears and implored me to refrain from interfering in the situation. I then inquired as to whether her request was intended for the benefit of the wider family. I replied, stating that the matter was between us. My mother-in-law sprang up and remarked that it was a matter of debate. Jenny inquired before I could respond as to whether I would be seeing Scott the following day. I confirmed that I would. She then asked what I would be telling him. I responded that I had nothing further to tell him. I had already informed him via text message of the images I had taken and that I had spent just under 3 hours with Mike. I had also sent him Mike's name and address, as well as his wife's contact information via email. I then stated that I would be providing Scott with support and a shoulder to weep on. "How about me, Chris?" I inquired of Jenny. "Don't I also deserve support?" I asked, grinning while gazing around the table. "I believe you have plenty of support," Jenny replied. "I'm going to go with Scott's advice on this one." "How do you know Scott isn't cheating on Jenny while he travels?" Betty, the girl's mother, noted. While I cannot picture Scott cheating, I replied, I must admit that I have no idea how he behaves when he is away. Yesterday, I had not considered the possibility that Jenny was unfaithful or that my wife was engaging in infidelity. The table erupted with accusations and disapproval. Mary seemed taken aback by my assertion, so I interjected and continued, emphasizing that I was being honest and informed. Mary shared with me that night that her casual and dismissive attitude toward Jenny's infidelity bothers her. Steve, the girl's father, informed me that Mary had never cheated on him. I was astonished to discover that my own negative perceptions of Mary were shared by Steve. I was acutely aware that my next words would have a significant impact on Steve's opinion of me. I therefore chose my words carefully, reducing the intensity and roughness of my voice and looking Steve in the eyes as I challenged him to prove his allegations. After a few moments of silence, I resumed, Steve, you cannot establish that Mary did not cheat on me. I raised my hand when Steve began to protest, emphasizing that I had placed my trust in Mary for 6 years. Last night, I informed her that my trust in her had been irrevocably damaged. Chris, I immediately stood up before Mary had finished speaking. I inquired of you 3 times last night if you were aware that Jenny was unfaithful to Scott. You refused to answer my question and instead changed the topic. You did not lie, but you were evasive. Yes, I looked at Mary, who admitted that I was aware of Jenny's infidelity. I did not support her, but I did not intend to create a situation as chaotic as this. She gestured with her hands, indicating our current concerns. I hoped that her affairs would succeed without Scott discovering the truth. I nodded, although I was deeply troubled that Mary was concealing her sister's infidelity. I could understand why she was protecting her sister. I recalled our discussion about the exclusive relationship a few weeks prior. She had then asked me, and I had nodded. She then looked me directly in the eyes and added, to be honest, I haven't had. Furthermore, I have not been involved in a romantic or intimate relationship since our conversation. Additionally, I have not been with another man since we began dating after college. I may be perceived as foolish, but in her words, I saw the angel I had married 5 years earlier, whom I adore and believe in. I informed my fiancée that her family was gracious enough to allow us a few moments of silence before we resumed our conversation. Steve seemed pleased with this turn of events, but he inquired, what are you going to do? In regard to Scott, I am merely extending support to my closest friend, just as you will be offering support to Jenny. Scott is deserving of my assistance, and I will provide it for the next 6 weeks. During this period, Scott relocated from his residence to a neighboring apartment. He promptly filed for legal separation from Jenny, but not for divorce. I had dinner with Scott every Wednesday, while Mary maintained the same schedule with her sister. It was Tuesday, and I was having lunch with a couple of colleagues. At Clyde's barbecue bar, I was dining with colleagues at a table for 4 when a man slid back an empty chair and sat across from me. I recognized him as Mike, a former colleague. I greeted him and asked how he was doing. He replied that he had heard that Colleen had ended their relationship and that he was no longer the primary caregiver for his children. I asked him how he felt about that. He responded that he did not care. It is your fault. I observed that my companions, Carl and Joe, appeared moderately amused. I turned back to Mike and said, yes, your divorce is my fault. Mike grinned and confessed, I suppose it's partly my fault, but there are so many married women around that I can't be faithful. Mike went on to say more, and I began to feel horrible about his response. I realized that my specialty is entertaining married couples. Mike nudged Carl to the right, and I understood that he was referring to Jenny, his sister-in-law. After her husband's departure from the community, I shared and traded her with my friends. He winked and informed me that she was really popular. His smirk confirmed that the conversation would continue as he reached for his back pocket and took out an envelope, which he tossed onto the table next to my plate. Mike informed me about the contents of the envelope, which contained images. I admit that my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I was rendered speechless, but I was determined not to be defeated. I placed the envelope in my tracksuit pocket, attempting to conceal my emotions. Mike then asked if I would show it to my friends. He laughed again, asking what was wrong and suggesting that I had nothing to say. I had to respond, so I stated that Mike was possibly the dumbest jerk in the world. When I told him this, he still had a huge grin on his face. I then gave Jenny Scott's husband the images. I will file for divorce since you were Jenny's immediate boss. How long do you believe it will take for him to sue you and your company? You will be out of work in a week. It was challenging, but I began to laugh. He had underestimated me and was considering his next move. I asked, "Do you know that I grew up in this town?" "I am not concerned about where you grew up." This individual was in serious trouble, but I was not in a hurry. "I know everyone who." Mike did not appear impressed, so I continued. "Additionally, I am acquainted with a number of individuals who could be considered vile. I would like to suggest that you leave town while you still have the opportunity to do so. I am not intimidated by you. I have witnesses who attest that you threatened me." He then gestured towards Carl and Joe, who both laughed. Joe admitted that he is an idiot. "You are going to divorce and lose your children. You will be fired from your job and have to. It is essential to consider the financial implications of child support and alimony. It would be prudent to examine one's circumstances with a critical eye, as the consequences of inaction may be severe." Mike, with a demeanor of smug confidence, rose from his seat and issued a vehement verbal reprimand. He asserted that I was a weak individual, lacking in the courage to defend my position. As Mike walked away, I found myself grappling with a growing sense of unease. Back in my office, I examined the photographs in greater detail, seeking to identify the most disturbing aspects of a seemingly happy marriage. The video was even more distressing, causing me to experience a profound sense of despair. I took a moment to collect my thoughts and push through the overwhelming feelings of sadness and anger. I called Scott and requested his presence at dinner. After another 15 minutes of reflection, I extended an invitation to the other men to join Scott and me. As I sat at the table, I became overwhelmed with emotion as I shared my ideas. I came to realize that I would be unable to interact with Mary in a normal manner. I needed to remove myself from the situation. My firm required me to travel frequently for work. Almost every month, I had to undertake professional travel, with approximately half of these trips scheduled in advance. The remaining trips were often urgent and required last-minute arrangements. I sent Mary Whitaker a text message indicating that her financial account was at risk. That evening, Scott and I enjoyed a peaceful meal at a local restaurant. After ordering beer, I gave him the small stack of images that Mike had provided the previous day. Scott was similarly distressed about the situation, both for himself and for me. We concurred on the necessity of taking action. The dissolution of our marriage was the only viable option for us, and we considered the possibility of initiating legal proceedings against Jenny and Mike's insurance company. Ultimately, however, we decided to adhere to the counsel of our divorce attorney. After spending over an hour at our table, I observed Sal Mel entering the pub. He surveyed the room, noticed me, and proceeded towards our table. He paused to shake hands and converse with individuals at other tables. Sal was one generation older than Scott. My father, Scott, attended the same school as me, Trish, a year after I did. Scott owns a large car parts warehouse outside of town. When I was 16, I was practicing my serve on the high school tennis courts. Trish waved to me as she passed by the courts on her bike one July day. A few minutes later, I was gathering up balls scattered over the court. I looked up to see 5 classmates forcibly pushing Trish behind the baseball field's bleachers. Approximately 100 yards away, I surmised the probable rationale behind their actions and deduced that Trish was not the type of girl who would engage in such behavior. I hastily departed from the field and found myself beneath the bleachers in an instant. Trish's shirt had been forcibly removed, and she was screaming and crying in an attempt to protect herself as the perpetrators proceeded to drag her shorts down. Stan Malloy turned just in time for the rim of my racket to strike him on the nose, resulting in a loud burst of blood and the cessation of his movement. Joey Burns emitted a piercing scream as he collapsed to the ground. I was unable to recall much of the subsequent events, as I was rendered unconscious after being struck on the cheek by a blow from my racket. The 3 remaining assailants proceeded to subdue me and shake me vigorously as I lay on the ground. After landing the final few hits, they became afraid and fled. Trish continued to cry, and I attempted to gather my thoughts. We left Trish's bike in the field, and she assisted me in reaching the car. I was unable to operate the vehicle effectively. Ultimately, I arrived at Trish's residence. My vehicle had not yet come to a complete stop. Trish exited the front seat and fled into the house, screaming. I had to exit the vehicle and walk past her to close the door. Trish had left the door open as I closed it. I heard a rumble and looked toward the house. A large bull was running toward me. His facial expression appeared to indicate a desire to inflict harm. He only noticed the injuries to my face and my slumped posture when he got close. "You are Harrington's baby," he growled after me. I nodded slightly in response. I informed him that I believed I required an ambulance. "Mr. MLL," I slumped against the automobile, sinking slowly and painfully to the ground. Mr. MLL turned and shouted at the house, demanding an ambulance be called immediately. Mr. MLL crouched alongside me, lifted my chin in his palm, and turned my head so that our eyes met. He inquired about the circumstances surrounding my daughter's injuries. He wanted to know if someone had dragged her. He demanded to know if she was beneath the bleachers at the baseball field. I replied in the negative, and he appeared to be incredulous. He then asked what the perpetrators had done to me. His eyes flashed with anger as he spoke, but he did not complete the sentence. By the time I arrived at the scene, the assailants had already removed her shirt and were attempting to remove her pants. She was still wearing her bra and shorts. I was in a considerable amount of pain. I am certain that his cold glare would have terrified me. I am eager to ascertain the identities of the perpetrators, namely Stan Malloy and Joey Burns, who will be present at the hospital upon my arrival. I proceeded to crush their faces with my racket and informed him of the names of the other 3 individuals. As an ambulance and a police car approached my vehicle, Mr. Mell leaned in, and we ended up in close proximity, nose to nose. I could discern a faint odor of garlic on his breath, and his voice was barely audible. "Should you ever require a favor, you are encouraged to visit." Sal Mell S. approached our table and sat down without any introductions. I handed him an envelope containing photographs and waited for him to look through them. When he looked up at me, I informed him that there is a man here named Michael Smith, who works at Jimmy Sullivan's insurance office. I also informed him that Smith's interest is to transform married women into and share them with his friends. I showed him pictures of Smith and his crew accompanying my wife and my brother. In conclusion, it can be stated that my wife's mother nodded in agreement, and I posited that I hoped he would not be so handsome when he grew up. His physique would be less athletic, and he would have additional issues. We sat in silence for some minutes before S said anything. "Since both of you will soon be unmarried, you should join a gym. Perhaps you will opt to go directly to the gym after work every evening. You can spend a couple of hours working out together." Prior to embarking on a repast, he subjected us to a rigorous examination of our bewildered countenances. When he was convinced that we had grasped his meaning, he rolled his eyes, nodded to me, rose from his seat, and departed the public house in a slow and deliberate manner. I did not drive home after informing Mary that I was temporarily absent from the locality. Instead, I spent the night at the adjacent Marriott. The hotel provided the opportunity to speak directly with my manager, who agreed to let me work remotely and send an email to my colleagues informing them that I was leaving for a business trip the following week. The chair in the corner of the motel room seemed an uncomfortable choice, but I sat down and closed my eyes, allowing my mind to wander back over the previous weeks. Mary was obviously, due to the constraints of my position regarding her sister, I was unable to divulge details of her affair with Mike and his associates. This knowledge was a certainty for Mary. However, upon examining the potential outcomes of a divorce, I considered the possibility of fairness through honesty. Mary's continued deception, however, made this untenable. I was forced to confront the reality of her infidelity in the presence of my colleagues and friends. It is difficult to envisage a more disrespectful and humiliating scenario than that of sitting in front of my wife's pimp and discovering that she was a gangster. She was extremely unfair to me and, as a result, our divorce would not have been equitable. Consequently, I was compelled to seek revenge on Mary. I vowed to myself that I would destroy my wife and her closest friend in the same way that Mary had not had an amicable divorce. I attempted to leave my chair and walk over to the office desk in the corner of the hotel room, where I proceeded to make arrangements until approximately 1:30 a.m. I devised a plan for the in the event of my wife's unfaithfulness and deceit, I had considered the possibility of pursuing a divorce. However, if my plan failed, she would undoubtedly experience profound distress. Conversely, if everything proceeded as anticipated, the situation would ultimately result in a catastrophic and irremediable breakdown. On the following morning, I scheduled an appointment with a divorce attorney. Despite the attorney's counsel, I did not divide our finances. This matter would have to be postponed. I relocated to an extended stay motel and established a remote office until Friday. I deliberately avoided at that juncture. Mary's phone calls and texts indicated a high level of distress. In response, I sent her a text message stating that I would be away for the weekend. Throughout the weekend, she contacted me repeatedly, urging me to call her back. On Sunday, I was able to procure the necessary materials for my plan. After preparing, I embarked on a lengthy hike in the mountains. Upon returning to the hotel, I turned on my phone and began receiving messages from Mary, as well as from her family members and a few colleagues. Mary, a colleague, appeared distressed by my absence and attempted to locate me on Monday and Tuesday. I conducted my work activities from the confines of my hotel room, striving to conclude any outstanding tasks before my scheduled departure the following day. Wednesday, the designated day of departure, commenced with breakfast. I then proceeded to check out of my hotel and return to my residence. En route, I navigated through the parking lot of Mary's place of employment to ascertain the whereabouts of her vehicle. Additionally, I installed a GPS device beneath her seat. The installation of the necessary equipment and props at my residence required several hours. However, by early afternoon, I had completed the setup and was ready to commence my activities at 2 p.m. Monday. I kindled a fire in our living room fireplace. Mary and I enjoy sitting by the fire on winter weekend evenings. We drink wine and converse while snuggling up to one another, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. However, today was not a frigid February day, it was September. The outdoor temperature at the start of the day was 84 degrees. I waited until 3, at 5 p.m., I sent Mary a text message, informing her that I had just returned home. I received a call from her shortly thereafter, which I forwarded to voicemail. Instead of leaving a message, she sent me a text message. I considered this an unprofessional and unproductive use of our time. I monitored my laptop's GPS indicator, anticipating that Mary would leave work promptly. However, she was not due to arrive at 5:05 p.m. The fire was ablaze, and I was still adding logs to the top of the pile when the global positioning system indicated that Mary had commenced her return journey. The temperature in the living room was exceedingly high, exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which I considered optimal. My heart constricted, and I clenched my teeth in anticipation of her arrival. Mary entered the kitchen 3 minutes after opening the garage door. I heard her drop her briefcase at the door and sensed her presence as she stood in the passage leading to the living room. Upon entering the room, she observed me seated on the sofa, observing the fire on the table in front of the couch. A dish of cheese and crackers, as well as a bottle of wine, were present. I held a glass of wine in my hands, with the second glass situated at the opposite end of the table and intended for Mary. Mary inquired, "What are you doing? It's becoming quite hot." I responded, I had planned a romantic reception for my wife. 2 drops of sweat were visible on her forehead and cheek. The word romantic remained unspoken, and she did not complete the sentence. Instead, she moved a few steps toward the fire and crouched down. She picked up a half-buried object from a rock, which she held in her hands. She examined it closely before taking a step back and looking at the top level of the bookcase. I was concerned that she might have injured her back so quickly. She turned to face me, and her eyes widened in alarm as she showed me the book. The book's cover, which had been burned, was the only part that had survived the fire. Mary seemed unable to speak, so I informed her calmly that we did not have any kindling to start the fire. I used some of the ancient books to start a fire, nodding as I did so. I noticed the empty area on the top shelf where Mary kept a number of books. I had used only 4 or 5, but we still had plenty left to ignite the next fire. As I spoke, I stood up from the couch, took up Mary's wine glass, and extended it to her. Her expression shifted from confusion to rage. Mary's father had gifted her a book on the day she was born. This gift proved to be the most popular children's book of the previous year on the first blank page. On the page, her father had written her a sincere love letter. In this letter, he outlined his goals and dreams for his daughter. Each year on her birthday, Mary received the same gift. She owned 28 books. Each one was a memento of her father's affection. I clamped my jaws as I saw Mary cringe and tremble when her palm touched the book. The impact of her hand on my face was unclear. It was as though she were slapping or punching me. The pain was intense, and I was uncertain as to whether her hand had struck my left eye or her claws had ripped through the skin on my cheek. The contents of 2 glasses of wine ran down the front of my shirt and slacks. Her expression altered once more, and as she began to cry, I saw full perplexity with no words. She turned and rushed up the stairs to our second-floor bedroom. I heard the door slam closed behind her, and although I was devastated that my marriage had ended, upon observing my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I was gratified to note the efficacy of my strategy. My eye had become red and swollen, and Mary's fingernails had punctured my flesh, resulting in the flow of blood down my cheek. I then proceeded to call 911 on my cell phone, requesting police assistance due to a domestic crisis. I informed the dispatcher that my name was Chris Harrington and that my wife had physically abused me. After providing the dispatcher with his address, Mr. Harrington informed the operator that his wife had locked herself in their bedroom. He stated that he would wait on the porch until the police arrived. The dispatcher then inquired if he needed medical attention. Mr. Harrington replied that he was not seriously injured. The dispatcher remained on the line until the first police vehicle arrived. Mr. Harrington was aware that his call was being recorded and therefore took care to answer the dispatcher's questions in a careful manner. A vehicle approached the curb, and a second car arrived. The 3 police officers crossed the grass together. "Thank you for coming, officers," the ancient veteran inquired. "So I tilted my head so they could see the injury to my left side," I explained. "My wife, Mary, hit me." "Why did she hit you?" "Indeed, when we spoke with your wife tonight, I had planned to serve her with divorce papers. I inquired as to whether we would find any damage. I responded that I had never touched my wife or any other woman in anger." One of the younger officers then asked if there were any firearms in my home. I replied that I owned numerous handguns, which were all stored in a gun safe at my workplace. I informed him that my wife did not know the combination to the safe. When 2 young officers came into my house to discuss Mary, I asked the third if he would like to see a videotape of my wife was beating me. He squinted, attempting to make sense of my sentence. Several bars passed before he inquired, "Do you have proof of the assault?" I replied, "I have not looked. I believe I have proof." I then waved for him to follow me. My laptop sat on the kitchen table. I needed to boot up my computer and locate my cloud storage account. I opened the folder, rewound the movie by 30 minutes, and discovered the start of our confrontation. I pressed the play button and stood back so the police officer could see what he then waited until Mary had left the room and gone upstairs. After the second viewing, he tapped the communicator device on his shoulder and stated, "Arrest Mrs. Harrington." My pulse raced as soon as I heard Mary cry from upstairs. I knew the officer had asked me a question, but I wanted him to repeat it. I was unsure whether to answer the question, but I knew I had to be honest. I replied, "No, the living room is the only room under camera surveillance." With a camera, he nodded in agreement and scratched his chin thoughtfully. He then inquired, "How long have you had a camera in your living room?" I responded with a shrug, indicating that I had only recently installed it. Mary then shouted and pleaded, interrupting our dueling looks. She demanded, "Chris, what the hell is going on? Please help me." I was preparing to react when one of the young officers suddenly exclaimed, "Sir, this is a police investigation. Please go immediately." He was addressing an elderly man who stood in the open front door of my house with the same. The man's demeanor was authoritative. He stated, "I am an official bailiff who has been assigned to serve Mrs. Mary Harrington." He proceeded to approach Mary, while the 3 officers took a step toward him in case the situation escalated. The man inquired, "Are you Mary Harrington?" When Mary nodded in affirmation, he handed her an envelope and announced, "Mary Harrington, you are being served." He further stated that she had been issued a restraining order, which prohibited her from approaching Mr. Christopher Harrington, his home, or his in the workplace. Mary was placed in handcuffs by the officer who had been holding her by the elbow. This was done in the presence of the bailiff, who had departed. I then turned to Mary and observed a transformation in her demeanor. The panic and confusion that had previously been evident on her face were replaced by a sense of tranquility. She then gazed at me and inquired about the source of the information. Mike had informed me. As the 2 younger policemen led Mary to the rear of the patrol car, the 3rd officer provided me with his business card and requested that I submit a copy of the videotape. I then proceeded to the front door. I observed as the initial vehicle departed with Mary. The senior officer halted his vehicle approximately halfway up my driveway. He then queried, "Have I encountered you at the pit stop on previous occasions?" I confirmed that I had recognized him from the occasion when I divorced my spouse for infidelity. He informed me that 4 years ago, I had divorced my wife for adultery. As a result, I am responsible for providing alimony, child support, health insurance, and the mortgage on the family home. She shares with my children and her unscrupulous boyfriend. Perhaps the next time I see you at the pit stop, you will allow me to purchase you a beverage and elucidate the circumstances that transpired today. I went to work the following day and was able to be relatively productive, having survived Thursday and Friday. I even vocalized my displeasure when I arrived home Friday night and discovered my father-in-law was situated on the front step, driving into the garage. I exited the vehicle and requested Steve's presence. Upon his arrival, I had already poured 2 substantial glasses of Knob Creek. We proceeded to engage in a brief, yet contemplative, conversation at the kitchen table before he posed the question, did she also engage in infidelity? I simply nodded in affirmation. He inquired as to whether there was hope. I took 2 more slow drinks before I could relax enough to be kind and respectful to Steve. I responded that it had happened more than once with more than one man. I took another sip and told Steve the whole thing. It was not just one man at a time. He glanced at me with incredulity and before he could respond, I informed him that I had viewed photographic and cinematic material that induced a strong urge to vomit. Steve retreated in his seat, turning white, and a tear rolled down his cheek. We sat together for an extended period, each of us wholly absorbed in our own thoughts and recollections. Mary and Jenny did not engage in this introspective activity. It would be prudent to ascertain whether this behavior was learned from their mother or me. His intense gaze was simply glacial, and it became evident that everyone was in agreement on this matter after a few more minutes. Steve then rose from his seat and strolled around the table. When I stood up, he embraced me closely and pressed his body against mine before releasing me. He then proceeded to approach the door with the same gait of a 90-year-old. The elderly man opened the door and, glancing over his shoulder, added that burning books was a terrible thing to do. I had entirely forgotten about the method I had employed during my dispute with Mary. I was so shocked that I almost screamed. I left the kitchen and returned a few seconds later with a small package. I held it out to Steve, who opened it. He glanced at me, clearly stunned. I told him that I knew he cherished those books and that I would never trash them. Then, I asked him, how could he think otherwise? He was so taken aback that he was unable to complete his thought. I informed him that I had gone to the bookstore and purchased a copy that Saturday morning. As was my custom, I sat at the kitchen table perusing our local newspaper on my tablet. I smiled when I read the following item: Hartford Times local section, West Hartford police investigate assault on local man. The article reported that a local man had been the victim of a vicious attack as he left a neighborhood tavern in the Elmwood area. Michael Cath was also attacked in the parking lot of Tops Bar at approximately 10 p.m. The time is 30 p.m. His injuries were severe enough to require hospitalization. A local police official stated that officers have multiple leads and anticipate making an arrest soon. It was a bright, sunny November morning. I observed as a red Ford SUV parked a few spaces away from me and the driver slowly exited. "Mike, you look like trash," he said. I was in the parking lot in front of Jackson Physical Therapy, sitting on the open rear door of my Ford F-150 pickup. Mike had an appointment at 10:30. According to a reliable source, I continued, it would be beneficial if you could obtain a handicapped sign and park near the building, as other disabled individuals have done. Mike has knee and foot injuries. His jaw was crushed and will be wired for at least another month. The cat has a tongue. I inquired with a smirk. I must commend Mike. He waddled over to me, leaning on his cane, and stopped 10 feet away. He was aware that Scott and he had been questioned by the police and later exonerated, but it was evident that he was aware of our involvement in the incident. His gaze, filled with hatred, made it apparent that he was filled with a profound animosity. I was certain that he imagined a horrific ordeal that would last for months. I was convinced that Mike and I would cross paths again in the future. I was determined not to live the rest of my life in constant fear, so I arranged this meeting. Mike slowly turned around and I initiated the interaction by stating the name of the individual in question, Mary Marie Smith of Milford, Connecticut. Upon his turn of gaze, I proceeded to provide the names of 2 additional individuals, Susan Burke from White Plains, New York, and Lori Fitzpatrick from Brockton, Massachusetts. It was evident that the initial rage had been replaced by a state of confusion. In the event of an untoward incident, such as a plane disaster, drowning while on vacation, or a fall down the stairs, I have made arrangements for my associates to pay visits to the aforementioned individual's mother. I observed a slight tremor in his hand while he was holding his cane. My colleagues will inflict similar injuries on their faces and legs as they did on yours, Mike. I wanted to ensure he was paying attention. They will strike them in the groin in the same way they did you. I waited a few moments for him to process the information before I finished. While your mother and sisters write in agony ironies will persuade them that their assault was your fault. I was taken aback. Mike stared at me for several moments before nodding abruptly. I was uncertain if he was indicating agreement or announcing a truce. He then turned and stumbled toward the door to the building. I am pleased to inform that this was my final encounter with Mike Smith. I had granted my divorce attorney the authority to handle all legal matters. Following our separation, we had no children and earned a similar income. Most importantly, I was only concerned about parting from Mary a few weeks after suing her. I received a call from my lawyer, who informed me that we had achieved an agreement that was almost identical to the terms we had discussed. However, Mary will not sign it until she has had a chance to speak with you. I expressed my frustration with a profane exclamation and was simply warned. Do it. Sit down and let her talk it out. Get this over with. Here's what I'll agree to. Mary signs the papers and you approve everything, so it's official. I'll meet with her for an hour in a conference room in your office. Once she signs the paperwork, I heard you did it, and suddenly the call terminated. 3 days later, I was seated in the conference room. June the paralegal knocked on the door, opened it, and told me everything. The document was duly signed and notarized. The woman nodded and moved away from the door, leaving Mary standing at the entryway. It was evident that she had attempted to dress and apply makeup, but her appearance remained striking. Even in her sweatshirt and hair, she strolled around the table, leaned down and kissed my face before sitting across from me. She inquired, "Are you nervous like I am?" At first. I considered her approach somewhat unconventional. I considered initiating a conversation, but then I reflected on her inquiry. I shrugged and admitted that I was not nervous. I was more concerned about the prospect of immediate resolution and the subsequent resumption of my life. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she informed me that I had been blackmailed. Mike had planned to post a video of Jenny on the internet. Her father had called me early in the divorce process and conveyed the same information, so I was not surprised. The incident may have originated with blackmail, but I viewed the footage in its entirety. I became increasingly agitated with each passing second and sought to compose myself after a brief interval. I resumed my discourse. You may have felt compelled, but this is no justification for terminating our marriage solely on the basis of discovering that Jenny is a. I was taken aback. I saw no viable alternative. Did this mean you were obliged to become one? Mary interjected vehemently. I was perplexed and saw no recourse. What could I have done? You could and should have trusted me. Mary rolled her eyes, which caused me to become upset. I proceeded with Jenny. We would have contacted the police and filed a report. We will never know if the police were able to gather sufficient evidence to take action. However, we can assume that his wife and employer would have discovered the truth, which would have provided us with some gratification. Most importantly, we would still be together. Unfortunately, you did not trust me. I am unsure whether you ever trusted me. I am unsure as to the exact nature of your inquiry, Mary replied. Do you recall the circumstances that led to our initial separation? This is the first time you are referencing this event, correct? Mary appeared to be experiencing a high degree of perplexity. What is the relevance of this discussion to the events that transpired during our high school years? You did not trust me sufficiently to divulge your desire to assist your neighbor, Jimmy, and accompany him to the prom. Are you being deliberately disingenuous? I was naive and intimidated by. Did you also display a lack of judgment and maturity in college? I inquired, when she gave me a quizzical look. I continued throughout Labor Day weekend before you went to college. We engaged in sexual intercourse on a raft on Lake Simpson, and we agreed to be faithful and marry after college. Did your promise endure for the entire first year of college? Mary asked, in a tone that indicated she was seeking a definitive answer. My mind was preoccupied with the futility of her inquiry, so I responded that regardless of one's opinion, it is unlikely that I have ever been trusted. It is reasonable to assert that I have compelling reasons not to believe anything you say. You are a proven liar, and when you are not lying, you engage in word games and conceal facts to alter the course of the conversation. Mary informed me that I have not seen Mike since the issue began. I responded with a smirk. Mary inquired about Mike's accident, which prevented him from performing at his previous level. I asked her what she was referring to. I replied that, among his injuries, both of his testicles ruptured, and one was surgically removed. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she asked how I could know about this. I responded that I had paid to make it happen. She covered her face with her hands. He stared at me across the table. A cruel man, Chris. I'm scared for you. I was taken aback by her outburst and found myself laughing. Mary was visibly upset and asked if I could truly deny my feelings for her. I gave a shrug and replied that while I could not say that I did not love her, I was also unable to say that I loved her. She then demanded that I explain why I was not willing to invest the time and energy required to nurture the remaining love I had for her. I informed her that it was a straightforward matter. I looked her directly in the eye and stated, "You are not worth it." Mary leaned back in her chair and visibly shrank back, tears continuing to flow down her cheek. I could see that she was breathing through her open mouth. I reached into the folder on the table in front of me and pulled out 3 photographs. I placed the pictures in front of her, one by one. It is my considered opinion that my future children and I deserve a mother and wife of greater moral caliber than the individual in question. I bid you all farewell. I would like to express my gratitude for your attention to today's account. If you found this essay to your liking, I would be grateful if you would consider liking it and subscribing. If you have a story to share regarding your or someone else's situation, I would encourage you to contact me. I wish you all well.